Good morning. And yes, my name is still Allison.
I am Joe Fishkay, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning on this fourth morning of CHI. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
So, we are here again to celebrate CHI for Good with two amazing people in conversation. You're going to start the intro?
Yes.
Yes. Just a little bit.
No, well, I've forgotten we swapped it today. We swapped it today because the people that we've got coming have a particularly special relationship to CHI. And Alison's going to tell you about that, particularly how Alan was shaped by you when you were a graduate student, I believe, is the main story, right?
Yeah, I was sort of a bit of a lump of clay, yes.
Something like that,
yes.
Something like that. The theme, as you know, is CHI for Good, and one of the things that we thought was particularly valuable about these people is the contribution that they have made both to CHI and HCI in general, but to society as well. And that's something we wanted to make sure we brought people who had reflected that in all sorts of different ways. Alison, do you want to introduce them?
Yes. So both of these gentlemen have truly changed the face of computing. Vishal has done this in industry primarily, and actually when I was talking with them backstage, I said, so Vishal, how should I be introducing you? And actually Alan said, well, just introduce him as one of the best CEOs in all of the United States, or maybe all of the world.
It was the best CEO in the Fortune 500.
Oh, okay, right. That's
the direct
the
quote.
Best. Yes, he is the CEO of Infosys. He has had leadership roles at SAP. He himself has his own research in artificial intelligence, brought the notion of timeless, what is it? Here we go, timeless programming, was it? Yes, I have it in here. It was, okay, I'm sorry. I'm looking at it, but I'm not finding it. But anyway, so all said, Vishal is a doer, a thinker, and a changer. And what is amazing about him is not just the companies he's worked for, but how many nonprofit organizations his companies have spun out. And we'll talk a little bit more about those nonprofit organizations when Vishal and Alan join us. As for Alan Kay, it is very hard to give any introduction to Alan. It is very hard to say, well, his biography is he worked here, he worked here. He is the grand thinker of what we think about in terms of mobile computing. He makes people think. Back in the days of Xerox PARC, when people were just trying to struggle with command line programming, he helped to lead people out into a visual, interactive space. He has advised many Fortune 500 companies, been a part of Apple, of Disney, of many other organizations. He's now at his own nonprofit organization, Viewpoints Research. But to me, I had the honor of having him as my thesis advisor when I was at the MIT Media Lab. And Alan asked me the most important question of my career, and I continue to tell people this, which is, if you could design any new technology for children, what would it be? And my problem is, I have not answered that question in my 20+ years of working on this. Every time I have ever gotten a chance to chair a conference, Alan has been a part of it in some way. And you know, yesterday, we didn't even expect Alan to be here, and he spent 3+ hours with our student volunteers, just sitting there, talking and thinking about the future with them. That says a lot about who he is. It says a lot about who and Vishal are about giving to all of us for the future. And with that, let us join us to the stage, Alan Kay and Vishal Sikka.
Hi.
Hi.
I think I'm supposed to sit here.
I think you're there.
Okay.
I think I'm going to go there. One reminder, we're going to be asking questions using Slido.com again. Go to Slido.com, put in the hashtag CHI2016. We're not going to have any pieces of paper passed around. I got fed up with it. So no more pieces of paper. If you want to ask a question, if you want to see what questions other people are asking and want to know, please go to slido.com, enter the hashtag Chi2016. You can look at other people's questions, vote them up, and ask your own.
And now we're going to be doing something slightly differently because Alan and Vishal insisted on this, that we not leave the stage and that we start with the question for them. So this is different than the last two conversations we've had, and this is not because I need to be on stage with these two amazing gentlemen, and I love hanging out with him.
Thanks.
Okay. So when we were talking about what questions they might ask each other, I threw out a few questions, and then of course, Alan and Vishal say, well, wait a second, why don't you ask questions? And so I said, oh, no, don't do that to me. But anyway, all right, so we're throwing the first question here. Alan and Vishal, you both have had visions of what is possible for computing in the future. Today, we live every day with the seeds of your work, for example, the Dynabook, GUIs, operating systems, and so on. So what's tomorrow's seeds? If you both could design the future, what's just on the horizon that we should be seeing? And what's down the road a bit that we shouldn't miss?
Well, let's get Vishal to start with the answer because he's the CEO of a very large company with a couple of 100,000 employees and is in the process of changing a culture there that is already deep into learning, but to change it for the futures.
Well, first of all, Alison, as we were walking up here, we were thinking that everybody who woke up so early to come and see us probably already knows about us. I hope all of you guys are awake.
Yeah, we should. I was just mentioning, they once asked Marvin Minsky if he'd teach a course at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I don't know, I've never been up that late. So I presume you didn't get up early just to come here.
No, so if you look at a company like Infosys, we have 200,000 employees that work on close to 10,000 projects. And yet you find, not only in my company, but in all companies like this, a severe lack of basic things like collaboration, the ability to work together with others, and so forth. So we started a pretty large-scale program called Zero Distance to get people to collaborate, to get people to see what others have done that could be learned from. And as you do that, you realize that basic interfaces for helping a team find out what other teams have done and bring that into their own work, or decontextualize the work that others have done so that they could benefit from it and they could relate themselves to it, are not there. And yet we know that when we collaborate, a team that works together can be exponentially more powerful than any individual, no matter how smart the individual is. So one of the things that I think is around the corner is the better abilities to collaborate, better abilities to learn. Of course, I'm an optimist. You always think that these things are around the corner. We haven't seen much happen yet, but I think better abilities to help us improve what we are doing, to help us make discoveries, help us find what others have done that may be related to what we are doing. Alan has just started working on a great new adventure around rethinking some of these basic ideas on learning. So those are some of the things that I would see are around the corner.
So that's a good lead-in to just bringing up the name of Doug Engelbart. And I spent 3 hours or more yesterday talking to student volunteers, and I found that everybody had heard of Engelbart and that he had something to do with the mouse, but nobody in that conversation could tell me anything else about him. None of them had typed Engelbart into Google. This is incredible to me because we put a lot of effort in 40 years ago making it so you're only a couple of button clicks away from finding out about things that you should be curious in and finding out. Yet nobody had taken the trouble to even do that, because in the first 5 hits, if you do it right now, you'll find a Wikipedia article about what he actually did. You'll find the website of the Bootstrap. You'll find the 75 papers he wrote, most of them about exactly the issue that Vishal brought up. You can see what they were doing for collaboration back in 1968, which is close to 50 years ago now when that big demo happened. And you also see that almost none of this actually obtains today. And this, to me, is what's wrong with, let's say, your organization. Because if you measure things about bad interfaces, it doesn't tell you how to do a good one. Right? You can't debug a lump of clay into a beautiful statue. You have to have some vision that you're trying to approach there. And so to me, what hasn't happened over the last 35 years is concerted efforts in getting to the real problems of interacting with computers. And some of these were tackled very well by some of our founders of our field in the past, like Engelbart. Some of them were merely articulated as really important problems, like shouldn't the user interface be able to be proactive and help you to learn things, as well as being reactive and helping you to move around it. So the fundamental issues, to me, I don't see generally in computing, and I don't see them in the human user interface community. So I think the good news is there's a lot of really good stuff that can be done if you can find a way of getting away from, say, writing papers and worrying about peer reviewers, but just start looking at these issues. And this is why talking to a visionary from industry like Vishal is critical, because he doesn't want incremental improvements on the way his business or any business is running now any more than Engelbart did. He wants to solve some of the big problems of the world. And this is why, in part, why Infosys has put up so many public benefit foundations over the years. You should mention the one in this country.
Yeah, I mean, one of Engelbart's ideas, big ideas that Alan told me about many years ago was this idea of how organizations can improve. And this is something that is common, as far as I can tell, to all organizations, that there are these A, B, and C tasks. The task A's are the ones that we are usually focused on, which are the things that we are working on. And we usually also have B tasks, and which are the tasks that help us get the A task done and help us improve the A task. But what Engelbart said that was very profound was that in great organizations, just as in great organisms, there are these C tasks, which are the tasks that help us constantly improve the B tasks and help us find the new A tasks. And usually, most companies don't have the C task. I mean, the Xerox PARC was an example of a C task, and it is a very basic thing that companies don't have. And when you think about what kinds of C tasks there would be, foundations, research organizations which think about the blue plane stuff, the long-term kinds of things in an unencumbered way, is an obvious thing. Spending 1 or 2% of your profits on something that might end up improving the whole lot is something extremely in shareholder interest, and we don't think of this type of a thing. I was at an event recently, I won't say how recent, and I was thinking about some of the tools that have been around for 20, 30 years and how little they have improved. And it is because we constantly keep searching for the incremental stuff. And if you had thought that this tool was going to be around, there are many, word processing, spreadsheets that have been around for decades. And if we had thought about the fact that people might be using these things 2 or 3 decades into the future, we might look more seriously into solving some of the fundamental problems.
Yeah, just to add on another Doug Engelbart. I keep on bringing up Engelbart here because it's not that he was the only person of great vision back then, but it's particularly relevant, I think, to thinking about problems of human interface. And one of the things to think about was that collaboration in their system was at what we would call the operating system level today. It wasn't something that might be stuck in a half-assed way in Google Docs or something, but something that was fundamental to the fact that you're on the computer at all, that every single thing that was done of any kind was an operating system function like we expect to be connected to the internet itself. So this is something to really think about. What would it be like if fundamental principles of collaboration? Another interesting one is the power of different perspectives on things up to the point of war. So one of the drivers of the whole universe is the fact that elementary particles are partly sticky and partly standoffish at different scales, and this generates most of the macro phenomena that we actually have. And if you try and use that as an analogy in human beings, you immediately see that human beings, and in fact most mammals, are partly cooperative and partly competitive. And they're done at different scales. The competitive stuff is much less useful in an age of abundance. The age of abundance came to pass because of our ability to learn how to cooperate with each other. And this is another part of what Engelbart said in his original 1962 proposal to ARPA. And boy, if you haven't read that, you're really not in the human interface field, because you're like somebody studying physics who doesn't really want to know what Newton did or how he did it. So these great visionaries, another one is Ivan Sutherland.
Yeah.
These great visionaries, their visions were bigger than we are. They're bigger than time. And they're things that are not worth sloughing aside just because they happen to be old.
I mean, this point, Alan, about knowing about the work of others, this is a very basic tenet of science. And yet in our discipline, in the computer-human interface discipline, and in computing, we don't...
Well, I don't think we have a field.
Yeah.
I think it's still basically a pop culture probing around. There are little pockets of this and that, but it doesn't act like any field that's taking its larger mission seriously.
Yes.
It's kind of a caricature.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna move you guys to the left a little bit, and I'm gonna talk about the fact that you all have been working a lot with nonprofits, a lot with the foundations. For example, Vishal, your nonprofit in India actually impacted all of India because you set the example, and then they made some kind of law because of you?
The Infosys Foundation has been doing tremendous work in just the general good for a long time. It was started by our founder's wife, Mrs. Murthy, and the 2% rule that we have now in India that was recently enacted was largely influenced by, among other things, our foundation's work. And beyond this general foundation, we have the Infosys Science Foundation, which supports the sciences in a very deep way. The ACM Infosys Award comes from there. And more recently, we started the Infosys Foundation here in the US, which my wife Vandana runs. And they have done some great work in the last year and a half on bringing computer science education to everyone. We don't realize that kids who are in school today are going to come out of school in the year 2032 or 33. And when we look at a future that far ahead, chances are that computing will have reshaped pretty much the entire world around us by then. And yet, are we really teaching kids computer science? Are we really teaching them how to think computationally in school? And so this is one of the things that they really focus on in the foundation.
That is interesting. And I understand that just very recently, Alan may have inspired yet another foundation you two might
Alan,
work on.
you want to talk about that?
Well, all the credit should go to Sam Altman.
Y Combinator.
Y Combinator, he's the CEO of Y Combinator. Truly remarkable. We call him a builder of civilizations.
Yes.
Man.
And 30 years old.
Really, it's 30 years old, and he's just the greatest thing ever.
So what are you thinking
well,
of doing?
so he contacted me a little over a year ago because he had gotten curious about basically the qualitative level of output from the big research funding of the 60s, and then, of which Xerox PARC was a tail end of. It was all one big community funded by the government because of the Cold War, but with all of the IP completely open and in the public domain. And the combined gross world product from the result of that fund, well, just from Xerox PARC, the gross world product from what Xerox PARC did is about $35 trillion to date. And so this is an interesting thing to think about of the difference, as Vishal was pointing. This is a C idea. The B, if you do A and B well, you get millions and billions. It's kind of, businesses have their sights set very low. They just want millions and billions. But really good researchers want trillions because it involves creating an entire new industry, an entire new way of doing things in the world. And that's what this government funding did. And Sam got very interested in this. And so we started talking about it, and I'm a refugee, you can see from my hair. I actually started graduate school 50 years ago this year. And that funding was only 4 years old when I started. So they had done their first round of stuff, and I was a second generation researcher in that, and I got to see how they did it and how it was done, and was very privileged to help set up Xerox PARC and participate in that. And Sam absorbed all of this stuff, and he came up with a tremendous plan, which was industry should somehow fund this because the government just checked out of doing this for a variety of reasons, none of them good, but that's just the way it is. And so he started raising money. Vishal chipped in considerable from his company. And so they set up a nonprofit called Y Combinator Research, which is a 501c3 company, open IP, and they've started creating research communities. First one was called Open AI. Second one is called Basic Income. In many ways, one of the most interesting. It's an interesting idea that keeps on coming back, and Sam is backing it. And then just yesterday, we announced a rather large one called the Human Advancement Research Community, which is kind of an ARPA organization based in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Cambridge, Mass., and soon in other places to try to deal with some of these problems. And we have some very, very good people who are founding researchers of it, including Brett Victor, Vi Hart, and others. So this bodes well for the future, that there are people with enough vision outside of just the simple things that business are trying to do to see that there's actually a world that is no farther away than a telephone call or an internet packet. And one of the most famous early thinkers in the Greek civilization was a guy by the name of Solon. And one of the questions that he asked the Athenians when they asked him to make laws for them, he said, what should be the penalty for not being competent in a society? And he didn't mean just mental incompetence, but suppose you're sick, suppose you're hurt, suppose you can't do this, suppose you can't think as well as others. What is the penalty for being in a civilization? And the answer is the whole difference between a society and a dog-eat-dog competitive climbing over other people is to answer that question in a reasonable way. So this is what the 60s research was actually about. The technology you have today came from people who are pretty much idealists, just like I am. And what we're seeing here, I think, is the most exciting thing ever, which is we're seeing people who have access to considerable funds grappling with this larger, smaller world that we really have to deal with.
So these would be like large communities. So explain this a little bit. So how
it is the Human Advancement Research Center,
Yeah,
like
explain
PARC.
that a
It is
little bit
PARC. In case you missed that, and it is funded by Y Combinator, but also supported by us, by SAP, by other companies. It has a great bunch of researchers headed by Alan himself, obviously.
Right.
And Hart and Brett Victor and Alex Warth and a bunch of very, very smart thinkers and doers. And it's cross-organizational, completely open IP, basically in the public good.
And so anything in the public good you can think about.
Yeah.
So
I mean, they will work on, obviously, on interfaces, on learning, on things that move us forward.
Yeah, I should mention that one of the main properties of this 60s research and carried into PARC was basically the thinking, the conception of problems, the organization of doing things was at the PI level, the principal investigator level. It wasn't top down. So the idea that the top can really help things by having a vision. So Licklider, who set all this up, his vision was, he said, the destiny of computers are to become interactive intellectual amplifiers for all people on Earth, pervasively networked worldwide. That was his one sentence. And he didn't try to make it into goals. This allowed him to hire a lot of smart people who had different slants. And this created a community of about 17 places, 3/4 of them at universities, another quarter of them at government think tanks like RAND and BB&N and MITRE. And the combination of the energy, the smartness, the different points of view, the arguments, created a very rich picture of what the future should be like. And a lot of the best elements that we have in our computing systems today, of course, including the internet and the graphical user interface and et cetera, they came out of this whole community effort. It wasn't done by any single research group. Even Xerox PARC, we thought of ourselves there as being less creative by design, because our job, we thought, was to finish off this ARPA funding and come up with a reasonable, practical solution to all the problems of networking and interaction and computing power and learning, and the best we could do in that day. And so we were actually a little bit more conservative as far as thinking up new ideas. We just stayed with what it was, and we tried to be have a set of designs where we actually built all of them. And for instance, the first thing that was like a Mac, we built 2,000 of them, and that was when their computers were hard to do.
So Alan, there's a question from the audience that I think is relevant to this topic we're sort of talking about right now. Do you think that our focus on startups, particularly those that are VC funded, as a culture right now, it just moved from under my eyes. Sorry?
I love user interfaces. Okay.
Inhibits solving the big problems.
Here's a great line from Negroponte. Years ago, he said, an infrared urinal knows more about what you're doing than your computer does.
Absolutely.
All right, so say that question. So say the question again. Start again.
All right, we're going to start. We're going to try this one more time. Don't move. Okay. Do you think that our focus on startups, particularly those that are VC funded as a culture right now, inhibits solving the big problems as opposed to an environment that's dominated by government funding and research labs?
Well, the the question is how much have we been taught and go along with that teaching to be moved around by what's swirling around us, and how much have we been taught to try and periodically step back and say, hey, wait a minute, there's more to the world than this. And if you think about it, the purpose of art is to get us out of our 7 ± 2 chunks that we're using to focus on any particular goals that we have right now, and to remind us, hey, there's a whole other world out here. And one of the purposes of education should be to get people to take that. This is what Buddhists, this means something else in Hinduism. I like what it means. But in Buddhism, it's the acknowledgement that we live in a world of illusions, what Kahneman calls System 1. It's there for dealing with things in real time. And so it's an incredibly disastrous gloss on what's actually going on. And so the way of answering that question is, no, startups are wonderful. But for crying out loud, don't make a religion out of it. And don't be confused with what the dynamic in startups is completely different than the dynamic in real research. Couldn't be more different.
Yeah. And you
have to
all
get
of
the current product out, and you have to get the second product ready to go out. And if you don't do that, you're done for. So you've basically taken off. It's like we used to say back at PARC, if once you put your optimization hat on, you've taken your design hat off, because you can't wear both of those hats at the same time. They're just not in the same psychic universe. So you just have to pick and choose when you're, like, again, just to say another PARC story, PARC was involved with building at least 100 of every single thing that we did there. And so there's an enormous amount of what you might call small-scale practical engineering that had to be done. And the constant fight there was to not just completely get buried by the technicalities and the optimizations that we did have to do, but to be able to pull back and do another thing. And it was striking to me that we did 4 completely different versions of Smalltalk, one every 2 years at Xerox PARC, each one of them operational. And there was never another version of Smalltalk once it hit the bricks to the outside world. It's crazy.
So,
but that's just the way it is.
Startups in that, absolutely. So startups in that sense are like the children, the young of our industry. You absolutely need a thriving startup ecosystem.
But don't get confused with that and the larger picture, because the startups, anything that involves engineering that is going to be used by human beings, even if it's soft, can't be cutting edge. You know, this is why we want engineers to design airplanes, not scientists and mathematicians. Scientists and mathematicians are even happier if the airplane crashes, because there's something to find out. Think about it. So the temperament of engineering, it's something that's worthwhile being able, it's like a suit, you put it on, but you don't want to confuse that with invention. Innovation and invention are just completely different things. One's incremental, and one is attempting to change the paradigm.
Yes.
So how do you balance that? How do you, if you...
It ain't easy. I mean, one of my many heroes, person I would ask a question of would be Michelangelo, because he was capable of enormous vision. But the great story about Michelangelo is him personally painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel over 4 years, lying on his back with candle, because it was closed, if you've been there. So candle wax is dripping onto his face. He's up there lying on his back painting this incredible ceiling for 4 years after having this insight of what could be up there. And one of the ways of thinking about the people I admire the most, like Ivan Sutherland, he would call himself an engineer, but he's also a genius. And so he had some of the best ideas ever had that were absolutely crazy to even think about, and really crazy to think about implementing them, yet he did it all himself in machine code in 1 year. and gave us something that is still hard to understand how it could possibly have happened. And so the balance there is part of the heuristics of being a researcher, right? Because we're not mathematicians. We live in a world where almost nothing that's interesting about computing can be proved. So when we go from research and when we go from creativity, the way we deal with understanding where we are in these ideas is we build them. And so we're kind of, at our best, we're enlightened engineering. We have artists who can smoothly move, like Michelangelo, who also did the dome on St. Peter's.
But did he do these
or
things by
Brunelleschi.
himself? But he did. But the people you're talking about, you're talking about people that did things by themselves first.
No,
No?
that isn't the way it
Okay.
the way it worked, because they had, for doing these frescoes, they had many assistants.
Ah, okay.
And in fact, Michelangelo himself trained in Donatello's shop. They all did. They all had ateliers.
Okay, so Seymour Papert always said that actually we should not be creating master teachers, we should be creating master learners.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, all of us should be a learning community together, and that we don't all know where the finish line is, and so together we're learning together.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, Vishal, your startups seem to be your foundations. And it's interesting because your foundations seem to be also in this collaborative sense as well.
Yes.
Well, also has really 1,000 startups.
Well, that's true,
in
but
his
I'm going
company.
to look at the 4 startup foundations at the moment, yeah.
So no, you're absolutely right. The foundations are, in some sense, the longer-term contribution. But we do have a startup fund as well. And one interesting thing is that over the course of a year, we don't plan this out in advance, but looking backwards, the amount of money that we invest in startup companies around us is roughly the same as the amount of money we spend on the foundations.
Really? Wow.
So we have a
Hear that, folks? Hear that? Okay, great.
We have a $500 million startup fund, and we don't say that, okay, we are going to spend $41.5 million a year on this thing, when we set out. But when we look backwards, it turns out that it ends up being sort of like that the amount of money we invested in the startups around us ends up being roughly the same, in the same ballpark.
Wow.
Can you talk about that in the context of how research happens at Infosys? One of the things that happens, different companies make different decisions about where research
Alan made a very
goes.
important point about the difference between invention and innovation. So first of all, saying that we have an innovation team in Infosys immediately says that the rest of the folks are not innovators.
That's a good point.
And anyone, a company of our size and scale, anyone could set up a lab with 30 people in Palo Alto and say, oh, these are the innovators, and which tells the rest of them that, I'm just, the innovators are over there in Palo Alto or in Israel or Berlin or wherever, and I'm just sitting here doing my thing. I'm not the innovator. I think this is nonsense. This is, you have to create a mindset that everyone is an innovator. So this idea that I mentioned earlier about zero distance is about 200,000 innovators, people who think about what they could do better, who are unconstrained by the statement of work. One of the biggest criticisms of a company like Infosys and others in the services industry is that people do what they are told. Many services companies wear this badge of honor called a best practice. But if you think about it, a best practice, why would you want a best practice? A best practice is not only not an innovative practice, it is a practice that is so common that you already know which one is the best one. And then these outsiders come and tell you that we will tell you the best practice, and which only means they have looked backwards enough that they know what everybody else is trying and which one of those happens to be the best one. This cannot possibly be something innovative. So to create a culture where these kinds of things can be done at a very large scale is extremely important. And then when you start to do that, you realize that the tools are not there. The tools to do better collaboration. We were joking about this robot that is walking around here and being able to make eye contact with it. Right
somebody goofed when they did that, because what the person is looking at is, of course, not the TV thing because it's up above where it shouldn't be. And how could that happen at a CHI conference?
I mean, the technology to see where your eyes are pointing is already there. You know, red eye reduction and all these things are done by the same principle. So we could easily program the ability to make eye contact into that thing.
Well, there are a bunch of papers of, even if the camera is offset, it's a simple transformation to transform the image so it looks like it's looking out from the screen rather. So this is like user interface 101, and it's painful to see. It's painful to see people using billions of devices that have forgot that undo is a good idea. That's really painful. That's ugly to see people go out to the top. Come on.
I mean,
let's use that to segue into...
Do you have an undo on that thing?
Clearly not, right? The top question right now is, what is the most prominent problem in HCI that you believe is still unsolved? Is it the undo?
No.
No.
No, these are... so I'll put out mine. This is something that we've periodically tried to get the national academies behind. And it has to do with something really interesting about our genetics, how we learn things in traditional cultures. Just tends to be by learning as remembering. Thinking is bringing up past cases. Traditional cultures change very slowly because they're mainly set up for coping, not for progress. So we're in a different world, but we have the same old genetics. And if you look at learners, maybe 5 to 8% are autodidacts who don't need a lot of external motivation and tend to make use of resources of various kinds, including people. But for most human beings, our primary hook into learning things is cultural learning. Cultural learning is learning by being around other people because a lot of it is social and there's a little technique mixed in there. And because of that, when you try to reform education, you're faced right away with the problem that a rather large percentage of the human population anywhere in the world, including this country, really needs to interact with human beings in various ways in order to learn. They're not naturally autodidactic. And there was an attempt in the 19th century to do exactly what you're talking about, because the object of learning to read in the 19th century in most American schools was not to learn how to read, but to learn how to learn from reading.
Yes.
Yes.
And this was articulated by a number of people back then. The idea was there's too much knowledge for getting it orally. And we can read 5 times faster than we can hear, and books travel in a better way. They're better than teachers. It's hard to train teachers. So this is stuff we've heard before. It's in the 19th century. Well, we're still in that place now, and for a variety of reasons, coming up with good teachers is incredibly difficult. So, for instance, suppose we had some new thing that would be really important for people to learn, and we could articulate this in media. We can make 5 billion copies of it almost for nothing now using the internet. But Vishal could spend an enormous amount of his budget, and he wouldn't be able to come up with 1,000 teachers, 1,000 good teachers to save his life in a year or two, right?
Yeah.
So the mismatch here is enormous, but it's similar to the mismatch between not enough Socrates going around and what the printing press did to us by getting some of what Socrates was about into media.
Yeah.
So one of the oldest dreams, and this is where my answer to the question, one of the oldest dreams that was on the scene when I started, still there, I think it's still the most important thing to work on, is that special thing that computers have that goes beyond what a book could do, but goes beyond it in the same vein as what a book is, which is to deal with the great ideas and the great teachers of ideas in various ways by allowing the medium to do more and more teaching to help us become the learners that can then be independent. That's a bootstrapping problem. So, like learning science is partly getting away from stories, but you need to learn science when you're a kid, and so you have to start teaching kids using stories and then gradually show them other ways of thinking about ideas that aren't in story form. So this is the big deal. It's been the big deal for 50 years since I've been in it. It goes all the way back to McCarthy's advice taker paper, which, by the way, none of the students I talked to yesterday had ever heard about. This was the first papers written about what user interfaces on computers should be about.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. Have you ever read this paper called Programs with Common Sense? Come on. This is still one of the great classic takes, because it's not the solutions he specifically suggested, but it's what he generally suggested and what he generally recognized had to be the case in order for this revolution to happen. Nobody knows this.
And a variation on that is this idea of helping us see better, interfaces that help us see better. We all sometimes stumble onto great interfaces that help us see things that are beyond our senses, that are beyond our time horizons and scales that we can comprehend. And those kinds of systematically making interfaces that help us do these things would be very interesting.
Yeah, we could say, a simple way of saying it is what people have drifted into, where we are today, is trying to take human beings as more or less as they are at birth, filled with our genetic propensities, and try to make user interfaces that fit to that.
All right.
So this is hang on. So this is the this is a key idea, because it's putting kids on bikes that have training wheels and not telling them that they are training wheels. That's what we're doing.
Training wheels are a horrible user interface.
It's a horrible idea, and if you've never seen the problem with a bike is it requires you to be different. But that is the whole point of the difference between hunting and gathering 100,000 years ago and where we are today. The whole point is we want user interfaces that help us be different than our genes try to tell us to be.
I think on that inspiring note, we should finish up. I'd like to thank both of you for coming. It's been such a pleasure to have you up here. Thank you very much.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks.